Hey, so right now I'm on a train to the Donbas, all the way from Kyiv. It takes about 9 hours and it's a really interesting route. In about 30 minutes, I'm about to pass through the city of Sumy, which is really close to the Russian border. And 2 days ago, they actually directly hit the train station. So I'm astonished they managed to get these tracks back online so quickly. But the Russians have announced that they're going to start hitting rail networks, the rail system in this country more extensively. And rail is fundamental in the war right now in Ukraine. And it's one of the reasons that a city called Pokrovsk, which has a pre-war population of about 60,000, has been so heavily fought over in the last year, basically. And now it looks like it's been fully encircled by Russian soldiers. And the reason they want that city so much is because it's a critical rail network. If you look here all the way back at a map of the Ukrainian rail network, there's a sort of spider's web dense network right in the Donbas section, and that's because historically it's been an industrial heartland of Ukraine. Coal, metals, steel, all exported across this country. And Russians basically weaponized the rail network to carry all their artillery, all their weapons, all their soldiers right to the front line. So if they can take Pokrovsk, they can turn that station into a logistics hub for their war. And that would be really, really difficult for the Donbas. It's also why they're trying to take Kramatorsk right now, Konstantinivka. These are cities that all have major train stations and rail networks. And this is how Russia's basically always done its wars. Since the 1800s, when it started laying tracks, it brought munitions and it brought ammo all across its empire. So rail is a fascinating part of the war in this country, but also the wars that have been fought in Europe as well. If you look at a map of Europe, the widths of the rail gauges are actually different in different countries, basically historically to stop invasions. Whenever I get this train to Budapest or this train to Warsaw, you stop at the border and for about an hour and a half, the whole train lifts off the tracks, and the entire undercarriage, the wheels with a different size and different width, gets laid down again. And basically this is historically to stop invasions by rail. And this goes all the way back to World War II. In 1941, when Hitler launched his invasion of the Soviet Union, he didn't just send tanks and troops, he sent trains, because every single army runs on supplies, fuel, food, ammunition, and all of it moves on rails. But there was a problem. The Nazis were rolling east on the standard European railway gauge, and the Soviets used their own, slightly wider gauge. And it doesn't sound like much, just a few centimeters, but it meant that the German trains literally couldn't run on the Soviet tracks. So, when the Germans crossed the border, engineers followed right behind the tanks. They called them railway pioneers. Thousands of men, sometimes engineers, other prisoners of forced labor camps, crawling across the wrecked landscape of Eastern Europe, pulling up Soviet tracks and hammering them back down just a little closer together. Every single day, they converted about 20 kilometers of track. So imagine it. Men with hammers and crowbars re-gauging thousands of kilometers of rail while the war thundered just ahead of them. They laid 16,000 kilometers of new gauge track in the first months alone. 16,000, it was one of the biggest industrial operations of the war, and it happened mostly out of sight. But the work was brutal. Soviet troops had torched bridges, they blew up stations, they destroyed locomotives. Literally as they retreated, the Germans had to rebuild everything from scratch. The bridges, the water towers, telegraph lines, under constant threat from air raids and partisans. The railway crews worked with the sound of artillery in the distance, often without proper tools or even good machinery. And the deeper they went into the Soviet Union, the longer and weaker their supply lines became. It was one of the great logistical nightmares of the entire war. The German army advanced faster than the railways could follow. Without the trains, their supply trucks were forced to travel hundreds of kilometers across muddy, broken roads. Engines overheated, tires burst, men starved or froze waiting for supplies that never came. By 1942, the cracks were showing. The railways that the Germans had converted couldn't keep up with the vastness of Russia, the sheer size. The supply network was basically patchwork, part Soviet, part German, all collapsing under its own weight. And basically, Hitler's troops weren't beaten just by the Red Army, they were strangled by their own logistics. And then the tables turned. When the Soviets pushed west, they did the same in reverse. As they retook territory, they ripped up narrow German rails and spread them back out to Soviet width. Train by train, kilometer by kilometer, they reclaimed their lifelines. In places like Ukraine and the Baltics, the rails changed gauge 3, sometimes 4 times in just a few years, each side trying to bend turn the steel to its own empire. It's hard to imagine now, but in that war, railways were just as strategic as oil fields or factories. They weren't just a way to move supplies, they were a weapon. Whoever controlled the rail lines controlled the tempo of the war. And all of it, those thousands of kilometers of steel, came down to a difference of just 90 millimeters. 90 millimeters that reshaped the entire logistics of a world war. So when you look across those old black and white photos of trains crossing into the east, you can almost see it. Men swinging hammers in the heat, sparks flying off the rails, the ground trembling as the first train rolled over new steel. And behind the front lines, a quieter kind of war was being fought. One of engineering, endurance, and sheer will. Because in 1941, the Nazis thought they could conquer the Soviet Union by force, but the land, the weather, and even the railways had other plans. And this even goes back before World War II, way back to the 1800s in Crimea. It was 1854. British and French forces had landed to fight the Russians. The target was Sevastopol, the fortress port right on the Black Sea. But once they got there, they hit a problem that every army eventually meets, and that was logistics. The British army was sitting on the coast, their supplies piling up by the water, while their soldiers were starving and freezing in the hills above. The roads were nothing more than mud and snow. Horses died, men dragged wagons by hand. So, Britain tried something completely new. They built a railway. They called it the Grand Crimean Central Railway, and it was the first purpose-built military railway in history. Engineers from Britain shipped everything in. Railway sleepers, locomotives, even workers, thousands of tons of iron, timber sent halfway across Europe by sea and then laid down in the mud and the blood of Crimea. And they built it fast, just a few months from concept to operation. By early 1855, trains were carrying food, weapons, medical supplies straight to the front. Steam engines puffed through the snow, pulling wagons loaded with gunpowder. The railway changed everything. It cut down starvation, it kept the army supplied, and it helped them finally take Sevastopol. It was the first time in history that industry had directly reshaped the battlefield. Not just cannons and muskets, but locomotives and engineers. And that very idea that war could be won by speed, steel, and logistics, it stuck. And every single major power on Earth started taking notes. Decades later, when Europe burned again in the First and Second World Wars, the lessons of Crimea were written in every rail map. So that very railway in the Crimean mud was the spark that turned iron into a weapon. So what looks like a quiet journey through the countryside in Ukraine is actually a journey through centuries of logistics and war. So the history is absolutely fascinating. And now looking forward, in 2025, it's been announced that there are going to be new rail gauges at EU standards built to Lviv from the rest of Europe. And that's basically part of modernizing Ukraine and connecting Ukraine more seamlessly to the rest of Europe. So I've got a few hours until I get to the Donbas, and I'm basically going to bring a frontline update. There's so much going on in Liman, in Kupiansk, in Konstantinivka, in Pokrovsk right now, and there's so much information on X, in the news that's contradictory. I find the best way to actually find out what is really going on is to physically go to these places, speak to commanders, speak to the soldiers that are fighting there every single day, and really try and understand what is going on. So in the next few days, if you want an update physically on the ground, I'm going to be doing exactly that. So if you like this video, please leave a comment. I love reading the comments. I love reading feedback, and I will see you with my new report in a couple of days. Thanks.